A federal judge ordered the Department of Veterans Affairs to restore its labor contract with its largest union. The VA says it has complied with that ruling, but documents show that it isn't actually implementing the contract's provisions. The case focuses on an executive order President Donald Trump signed last year, barring many agencies from collective bargaining. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman is here with more. Jory, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Terry.
What is this court case all about?
Right. So all of this goes back to a March 2025 executive order that President Donald Trump signed that barred more than 20 agencies from collective bargaining, expanding an already existing exemption under the Federal Service Labor Management Relations statute that prohibits agencies involved in national security with engaging in collective bargaining. And Trump says that there's a lot more agencies working in national security than previously listed under that exemption, and it includes the Department of Veterans Affairs and many others, saying that they actually no longer have the right to have employees in those agencies be represented by labor unions. It's interesting that this particular case is not dwelling on the legality of that executive order that is happening at some higher levels in appeals courts, but in the particulars of this case, a federal judge in Rhode Island said that the thing she's worried about is that this was unfairly applied at the Department of Veterans Affairs, that it was enforced for some agents, that it was enforced for some unions but not others, and that the Department of Veterans Affairs was retaliating against some unions that were more vocal against the Trump administration than others.
The VA says it has complied with the judge's ruling. How exactly did that happen?
Yeah, so the VA initially asked for clarification of what the judge's preliminary injunction meant. They questioned whether bringing the contract back meant whether they could re-terminate the contract any time between now and when it expires at some point next year, and whether it actually had to restore the collective bargaining rights for all of the American Federation of Government Employees, not just the National VA Council. This is a contract that does cover about 300,000 VA employees, so it is a pretty substantial contract. And then eventually it did tell the court that it is fully complied with the injunction and that they have restored the collective bargaining agreement. But what we've seen in court filings is that it is not enforcing and carrying out a lot of the key provisions of that collective bargaining agreement. For example, the collective bargaining agreement gives employees more unpaid leave if they've had a child, and a VA employee asked her supervisor whether she was entitled to that extra leave under the contract, and she was told no, actually, that the leave provisions of that contract are still no longer in effect, and she has to come back to work. Same thing with VA officials telling third-party arbitrators that they actually don't have to continue deliberations and ongoing grievances because that the VA still doesn't recognize the union. And so the VA and Justice Department employees representing the VA, they recently told the court that plaintiffs have conflated the court's order reinstating the master collective bargaining agreement with adhering to each and every one of its terms. So that's a bit of a head scratcher that they've brought back the contract, but they say that they actually don't need to enforce some of the key provisions of that contract.
I can imagine the union has thoughts. What are they saying?
Yeah, they are upset about what the VA has had to say about all this. AFGE National President Everett Kelly says that the VA has failed to reinstate a single one of the union's members' rights. And the National VA Council President Mary Jean Burke said in these court filings, said to VA officials that the VA is violating a binding court order by not implementing these provisions.
It doesn't sound like the two sides are on the same page just quite yet. What will be the next steps in the legal proceedings?
So this is still something that is being played out at the appeals court level. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals is still taking a closer look at the legality of the executive order underpinning all of this. So, too, is the District of Columbia Court of Appeals. And even though this immediate case here in the federal court in Rhode Island is focused on these retaliation claims, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has kind of panned those arguments in the cases that it's been looking at. It stayed a lower court ruling saying that the retaliation claims don't really hold water. They say that the executive order from the Trump administration would have been carried out regardless of what the unions have said in opposition to the Trump administration's policies or not.
Jory, is it possible that this case and this ruling sets a precedent for how other agencies are dealing with their union contracts?
Potentially this is being argued broadly in so many different courts, in lawsuits led by so many different unions here. Hopefully we'll get some resolution soon in terms of what the appeals courts have to say about this. In the immediate case here with the federal judge in Rhode Island, she concedes that the legal challenges about the executive order itself, they could take years to resolve. That this is something that is not going to be resolved anytime soon. This is something that could take its way all the way up to the Supreme Court at some point, as we've seen with other federal workforce policies that have been particularly contentious. But what the VA has said in this immediate case is that it is trying to minimize some of the back and forth, that it is expensive to bring back these contract provisions and enforce them, if only for a while, knowing that a federal court could soon step in at some point and say, actually, you don't have to enforce those contract provisions.
That's Federal News Network's Jory Heckman. Jory, thanks for the clarity on this important issue.
Thanks, Jory.
You can find his full story at federalnewsnetwork.com.